Bienvenidos y bienvenidas todas y todos a este nuevo contacto internacional. En esta oportunidad desde Estados Unidos conversaremos con Peter Mclaren. Peter es un internacionalista, fundador de la pedagogía crítica, uno de los teóricos más reconocidos de la pedagogía crítica en el mundo. Es especialista en currículo y teoría de la educación, profesor distinguido en estudios críticos, codirector del proyecto democrático Paulo Freire. Además, es miembro de la Asociación Americana de Investigación Educativa, docente fundador del Instituto Mclaren de Pedagogía Crítica y Educación Popular. Además, es autor, coautor y editor de más de 40 libros de pedagogía crítica, entre otros destacados teóricos que ha escrito con él. Está Henry Giroux. Él tiene una biografía, un texto hermoso sobre Paulo Freire. Es catedrático de numerosas universidades en Estados Unidos, en México, en China, uno de los pedagogos más importantes del mundo. Bienvenido, Peter, a este contacto internacional. Peter, si te pidiéramos que hicieras una fotografía de la educación en el mundo, ¿cuál sería ese negativo revelado?
Well, it's an interesting question. I just took a photo in Mexico, in Ensenada, Mexico, of a school bus turned upside down. And it was an art installation. And so I walked over to the school bus and I lay down beside it under the wheels, actually under the roof of the school bus, because the wheels of the school bus were on top. The school bus was upside down, and I was lying beside the bus as if I had been thrown out in a tremendous accident, and I was lying dead beside the bus. And I sent the photo to mis compañeros, compañeras, mis camaradas around the world as a symbol of the death of public education. So I can send you this actual photo after the interview, and you can actually see the photo that I'm describing. That's what the photo would look like. A school bus for children turned upside down with the teachers lying as corpses around the bus.
Estaríamos entonces hablando del triunfo de la perspectiva capitalista neoliberal en la educación. ¿No hay esperanza entonces, Peter?
Well, there is a hope. The picture that I took beside the art installation, the bus turned upside down, represents, I think, for me, definitely the situation of public education in North America. As for the rest of the world, I think the challenge is very, very similar. Now, it's interesting. When I'm asked about hope, esperanza, when I'm asked about possibilities of change, I have to say that those possibilities can only come with the transformation of neoliberal capitalism into a new social universe of socialism. And I use the example of what's happening with the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. I talk about Vendir in Venezuela y Bolivia, por ejemplo. I talk about the autonomous communities in America Latina, in the Instituto Mclaren. We just graduated 90 students, 90, with their doctors, right? Doctorado. And many of them are from indigenous communities. For instance, the Porrapecha. And so in these instances, there's some hope.
Precisamente, Peter, a partir de tu experiencia en el Instituto Mclaren de México, en el área de formación docente, ¿cómo identificas tú cuáles son los principales desafíos en el área de formación de los formadores para poder defender la educación como un derecho humano fundamental? ¿Qué tenemos que hacer en materia de formación de docentes?
Well, the challenges are very, very huge. They're so large, they can defeat you psychologically. They're so enormous. They can paralyze you. But we have to resist this paralysis. And in order to resist this paralysis, we need to point to lights at the end of the tunnel. We need to have very powerful motivation to continue, because so many people are giving up, and so many people have already capitulated to the neoliberal assault. They feel that they're absolutely powerless to do anything. Well, to be specific, in Mexico, with the Instituto, I don't spend a lot of time at the Instituto. I'm the honorary president, and the Institute is run by others who are involved with the Mexican Communist Party, and who are very much involved in teachers' unions throughout the country. Now, what we have tried to do is we've created a conference called Volver a Marx. And Volver a Marx, we host it every year, and in different cities, sometimes more than one conference a year, in places like DF, right? Mexico City, Guadalajara, Monterrey, Morelia, Michoacan. So we have this. We had as our guests Marta Harnacker and Michael Leibowitz. Marta Harnacker, the last conference, and we're also, in addition to that conference, we have very strong connections to the sindicatos throughout Mexico. And what I'm trying to do specifically, now I'm now at Chapman University. And I'm in a very conservative university now in Orange, California. However, as the only Marxist, I'm able to operate, I'm still able to survive in the university. My mission is to create critical pedagogy as a movimiento social, transnacional. So I'm looking at creating a network through critical pedagogy, right? That's a transnational social movement. So if we can have critical pedagogy as a transnational social movement, that's one step. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. So for instance, this is very exciting. I have just been made the honorary director of the Center for Critical Education in China. Now, this is a big breakthrough. I met a politician and educator who just published Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed in Chinese. I was honored to do the introduction. So here's a country in which it's very difficult to discuss certain issues. obviously. There are a lot of sensitive issues in China that you really can't mention if you want to stay in the country. And yet, we have now a Center for Critical Education, and we're now publishing in Chinese books on critical pedagogy. For instance, a number of my books are in production now, and others from other educators will follow. This is an opening. This is a really strategic opening in China with such a large population. I was in Hungary this year. I was in India this year, and we're trying to create more Marxist organizations in the universities. So I see, and right now India is in a terrible position with the new president, Modi, who is a hyper neoliberal. So these are things we're attempting to do. I want to look at if neoliberal globalization is transnational, any effort that we make to defeat it must also be transnational. And so I see myself as attempting to develop a network, a transnational network of teachers, educators, scholars, and activists. We can only hope for the best.
Peter, compartimos la esperanza por el socialismo. Sin embargo, el socialismo, dicho solo como un bloque, intimida a algunos, porque precisamente la teoría crítica y la pedagogía crítica insurgen contra un modelo de socialismo autoritario.
Well, this is a great question. It's interesting. Yes, the language of socialism does intimidate many, many people. I've even found that to be the case in places like Colombia. I was speaking a few years ago in Comuna 3, a community 13 outside of Medellin. And the teachers there invited me to their school, which was called, at that time, La Independencia. And they said, Peter, not all your work is translated in Espanol. Tell us your new ideas about critical pedagogy. So I told them about critical pedagogy is a social movement towards a class struggle for a new protagonistic socialist society. And as I was talking, I noticed the teachers looking a little bit uncomfortable. And I asked them what was wrong. And they said, Peter, your language is much too militant. And if we speak like you, we risk our lives and the lives of the students. And I said, well, aren't you exaggerating a little? And they said, Peter, we want to show you some photographs from something that happened a number of years ago. And they showed me photographs of students holding white sheets in the air. Their community was visited by a helicopter gunship, a tank, 3,000 troops, elite troops, police, and the paramilitary, and who attacked their community and caused a significant amount of death and destruction. And they said, Peter, we like your practice, but we need to change the language, and so that we are under the radar. We can operate under the radar. Now, so I agree that that we need multiple languages that reach the same goal. If I'm talking to a militant sindicato, I can use the language of socialism and socialist struggle. However, en Estados Unidos, en las entrañas de la bestia, here, I use the language of ecopedagogía. Now, ecopedagogía has been developed by some of my students, my former students, who are now professors, and they're at the cutting edge. And they, at the beginning of the development of ecopedagogía, they were avoiding the question of capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. I think my contribution has been to emphasize neoliberal capitalism and the struggle for socialism in ecopedagogy. But it doesn't, so it's there, but the language is the language of, sustainability. It's the language of how can we keep the planet alive under neoliberal capitalism. And we need to develop alternative forms of social life. We need to organize ourselves. We need a new régimen de desarrollo. And what is that going to look like? It can't be a capitalist alternative. It must be a different kind of alternative. And then what I do, instead of pointing to Europe, instead of pointing to the class struggles of Europe, which most Marxists do, I say, well, let's visit and examine the communities, indigenous communities in America Latina, and let's look at their new epistemological alternatives, and let's begin there. And that raises very important questions and challenges to capitalism in Estados Unidos without using the Marxist language, which frightens people. I had a meeting with a woman who works at my university yesterday, and she works in the library, and she said, you're the first Marxist I've ever met, and quite frankly, I was very frightened about meeting you. Very frightened. And I'm surprised that you're such an open, flexible, and nice person. So, yes, I think that's one possibility, is this ecopedagogía, at least in North America. It addresses the question of, is capitalism sustainable? No, I don't believe it is. And what are the alternatives? I call the alternative socialismo, right? You might have another name for this kind of organization. And that gives the teachers a sense of autonomy, that they can come up with alternatives. And then you can say, well, these alternatives that you're coming up with do resemble socialism. And you might not realize it. And then they can begin to make a bridge to the larger struggle. And so that's one strategy.
Peter, si tuvieras que, desde la pedagogía crítica, empalmar con todo ese debate que hay internacional sobre el tema de la calidad educativa, ¿cuál sería tu definición de calidad educativa?
For me, all education has to be founded on the principle of alleviating unnecessary suffering. And when you look at that statement and that principle, you have to look at what are the structures, what are the organizational and institutional and economic structures that produce suffering, unnecessary and needless suffering, suffering that, well, human life entails a certain amount of suffering. We understand that, but I'm talking about unnecessary suffering and pain, loss of dignity, and living in situations in which you're humiliated, and in which your creativity has been taken away from you, your voice has been taken away from you. So we need to identify those structures. I call them systems of mediation. We identify them, and we work very hard in all our educational efforts, right, to transform those structures of oppression. Well, for instance, for me, capitalism is a form of structural genocide. We have genocide, ecocide, and epistemicide. Well, we know what genocide is. I was in India recently, where 100,000 farmers have committed suicide because, just over the last few years, because they can't afford to purchase the seeds from the agricultural corporations, and they've chosen to kill themselves, to take their own lives. I met a group of Indios in Mexico. Well, this group, I didn't meet them personally, but the Director General Sergio has met this group, who have chosen not to reproduce themselves. They want to become extinct. And when they were asked why, they said, life is too difficult and humiliating for our people, and we've chosen to not reproduce and to let our tribe die. So, now, that's genocide. Ecocide. The planet is dying. It's dying. The cities, my God, in Beijing, for instance, some of the planes couldn't land because they couldn't see the airport. My wife is from China. She's from a very poor village in northern China. Last winter, for a short time, they could only see in her city 8 inches, that far, because of the pollution. You had to walk with your hand out, with your arm extended, in order not to bump into anything. So and then just look at the species that are dying. Just look at the pollution that's unbelievable that people have to live in. So that's ecocide. Then there's epistemicide. Epistemicide is the destruction of knowledges from the original pueblos, destruction of languages and understandings and communal knowledge that is very valuable in helping us understand how to live in harmony on the earth. So that's what critical pedagogy needs to focus on: the prevention of genocide, ecocide, and epistemicide, always with the preferential option for the poor and the dispossessed.
Peter, atreviéndonos a soñar, si te pidieran los gobiernos progresistas de la región 3 ideas fuerza para transformar positivamente los sistemas educativos, fortaleciendo la pedagogía crítica, ¿cuáles serían, desde tu punto de vista, esas 3 grandes ideas fuerza que lo apuntalaran?
Right. Well, it's a great question. Well, the first thing I think that needs to happen is, right now, for instance, in the Estados Unidos, we're fighting what's called the Common Core. That's the new issue in the U.S. It's called Common Core. The great enemy of public education, his consulting firm came up with this idea. Bill Gates, okay? So you've got Bill Gates, the Walton family that owned Walmart. You've got all these entrepreneurs and these corporations, and you've got them basically designing the initiatives for educational reform without the involvement of teachers, without the involvement of parents, without the involvement of the community. So for me, the question is obviously, number one is community involvement, the connection between education and community development. This is absolutely fundamental to give teachers, workers, school workers, students, and parents, right, control over their education. Now, in the United States, they say the only way to do that is through private education, through free choice, right? So, so that would be one. And all education has to be connected to the development and improvement of the communities. Now, there can be the local community, there can be regional communities, and there can be national communities and international communities. So that's very, very, very fundamental. Secondly, that education cannot be driven by issues around economics. It can't be driven by capital, right? President Chavez talked about that. He talked about social quality, right? In the United States, we have something called total quality management. It's an economic model and a business model that rules education on issues of efficiency, right, etc. Okay, so third would be the question of how do we evaluate students? I would get rid of high-stakes testing of students completely. I would get rid of national examinations. I would get rid of the link between education and what's going on with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now we have, of course, a new bank, right, with Brazil, China, etc., right? You've heard of that, right? The BRICS. Who's to say the BRICS might not do the same thing? It might just be, if they're going to survive within capitalism, they're going to have to follow the model of the world, the same essential model of the World Bank. This absolutely has to be changed. It has to be eliminated. All educational directives have to be creating, right, freely associated labor and creativity. That cannot happen under neoliberal capitalism. Here's the issue. Look, in every country that I visited, everyone talks about educational reform. Most people talk about it without addressing the issue of neoliberal capitalism. There's only this tiny little bit that you can address. A very tiny area you can address about educational reform under capitalism. So we have to create structural changes, a movement towards socialism in tandem at the same time as we focus on educational reform. Now people say, Peter, are you a reformist or are you a revolutionary? Well, I say I look at education dialectically. Dialectics is not about either this or that. It's about both this and that. So, realistically, I do what I can in the space that I'm given. And yes, I do think incremental reforms are important, but I never lose sight of the larger vision of education must be revolutionary critical pedagogy towards the creation of a socialist alternative to capitalism. That is the only way we're ever going to get true educational reform. It cannot happen within capitalist society. You can, look, I've met really nice capitalists, good people. They care about schools, they care about education, they care about changing the world, but they cannot see outside of the capitalist box. So you can have good capitalists, but that's not going to help you in a system of capitalism, because they're obligated to follow the rules of capitalism. And those rules, those processes, those transactions will never, ever give us the kind of quality education that we need, the kind of social quality that we need, that President Chavez talked about. We need social quality. What does that mean? What was so impressive when I looked at the misiones in Venezuela was that the culminating project of each class, when I was in La Vega Sector B, right? The culminating project had to be linked to the improvement in the communities, right? It had to have that tangible outcome, that connection. That was critical pedagogy in practice, as far as I'm concerned. Schools that attempt to do that in the United States, unfortunately, are coming under increasing attack. Increasing attack. The attacks are vicious and frightening, actually, to be honest with you. I don't see critical pedagogy in the schools in the United States. I see little tiny reflections of some aspects of critical pedagogy. But these are domesticated, watered down versions of critical pedagogy. And they're really, to be honest with you, they're really actually helping to reproduce neoliberal education. Right? They are, in a way. They're not any education that doesn't challenge the basic premises of the structure of violence in capitalism is going to strengthen capitalism.
Peter, para ir finalizando este contacto internacional, nos gustaría que le dirigieras un mensaje a los maestros, a las maestras, a los profesores y las profesoras venezolanos y venezolanas que en sus aulas, en sus centros educativos, están discutiendo el tema de la calidad educativa como una oportunidad para avanzar en la transformación de nuestro sistema educativo.
Well, we live in a world in which multiple worlds intersect, right? And while I am not optimistic that we will see major transformations in education worldwide in the near future or even in the distant future, I still remain hopeful. I think we have to live with hope, but hope is meaningless and facile unless it's conjugated and accompanied by struggle, by class struggle. And there are no guarantees that our views will triumph and that education can be transformed into a weapon of creativity and possibility. When we have to live with this uncertainty, and we have to live without this guarantee. But we do this because we're part of the movement of history, and we're agents of history, and we cannot forfeit our agency. We can't give that agency over to the capitalists. They want us to feel a resignation. They want us to feel defeated, and we have to keep our spirits strong. In order to do that, we have to, right? We have to communicate with each other, and we have to develop a revolutionary consciousness, a militancy, right? A comradeship. And so there's a critical educational conference that occurs every year in Greece, in Turkey. The next one is going to be in Poland. There's movements occurring in places that give one a sense of inspiration and a will to defeat the pessimism that surrounds us. And I thank you so much for your connection to me and to others, because my relationship with you is what's giving me the kind of inspiration that's required to struggle here in the United States, Mexico, and other places that I'm very privileged to be able to spend some time. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be part of this discussion. Thank you. I really appreciate it so much.
Conversamos hoy desde Estados Unidos con Peter Mclaren, uno de los teóricos más importantes de la pedagogía crítica en el mundo. Gracias, Peter, por tus opiniones, por tu pensamiento en el marco de esta consulta por la calidad educativa.
When I'm asked about hope, esperanza, when I'm asked about possibilities of change, I have to say that those possibilities can only come with the transformation of neoliberal capitalism into a new social universe of socialism. And I use the example of what's happening with the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. I talk about buen vivir in Venezuela y Bolivia, por ejemplo. I talk about the autonomous communities in America Latina, in the Instituto Mclaren. We just graduated 90 students, 90, with their doctors, right, doctorado. And many of them are from compañeros, compañeras, mi camaradas around the world, as a symbol of the death of public education. So I can send you this actual photo after the interview, and you can actually see the photo that I'm describing. That's what the photo would look like. A school bus for children turned upside down with the teachers lying as corpses around the bus.
Estaríamos entonces hablando del triunfo de la perspectiva capitalista neoliberal en la educación. ¿No hay esperanza entonces, Peter?
Well, there is a hope. The picture that I took beside the art installation, the bus turned upside down, represents, I think for me, definitely the situation of public education in North America. As for the rest of the world, I think the challenge is very, very similar. Now, it's interesting.
Bienvenidos y bienvenidas todas y todos a este nuevo contacto internacional. En esta oportunidad desde Estados Unidos conversaremos con Peter Mclaren. Peter es un internacionalista, fundador de la pedagogía crítica, uno de los teóricos más reconocidos de la pedagogía crítica en el mundo, es especialista en currículo y teoría de la educación, profesor distinguido en estudios críticos, codirector del proyecto democrático Paulo Freire. Además, es miembro de la Asociación Americana de Investigación Educativa, docente fundador del Instituto Mclaren de Pedagogía Crítica y Educación Popular. Además, es autor, coautor y editor de más de 40 libros de pedagogía crítica, entre otros destacados teóricos que ha escrito con él. Está Henry Giroux, él tiene una biografía, un texto hermoso sobre Paulo Freire. Es catedrático de numerosas universidades en Estados Unidos.
Indigenous communities, for instance, the Borrapecha. And so in these instances, there's some hope.
Precisamente, Peter, a partir de tu experiencia en el Instituto Mclaren de México, en el área de formación docente, ¿cómo identificas tú cuáles son los principales desafíos en el área de formación de los formadores para poder defender la educación como un derecho humano fundamental? ¿Qué tenemos que hacer en materia de formación de docentes?
Well, the challenges are very, very huge. They're so large they can defeat you psychologically. They're so enormous. They can paralyze you. But we have to resist this paralysis. And in order to resist this paralysis, we need to point to lights at the end of the tunnel. We need to have very powerful motivation to continue because so many people are giving up. And so many people...
En México, en China, uno de los pedagogos más importantes del mundo. Bienvenido, Peter, a este contacto internacional. Peter, si te pidiéramos que hicieras una fotografía de la educación en el mundo, ¿cuál sería ese negativo revelado?
Well, it's an interesting question. I just took a photo in Mexico, in Ensenada, Mexico, of a school bus turned upside down. And it was an art installation. And so I walked over to the school bus and I lay down beside it under the wheels, actually under the roof of the school bus, because the wheels of the school bus were on top. The school bus was upside down. And I was lying beside the bus as if I had been thrown out in a tremendous accident, and I was lying dead beside the bus. And I sent the photo to mi compañero.